She said, I want to jump in the puddles and laugh at those who don't like rainy days. She said, I want to run in the downpour, oh, and feel the raindrops fall on my face.
The story's called Two Fellers by Maria Kyle. Patrick and Michael were lumberjacks, and they both lived in log cabins in the deep forests of British Columbia, which is in western Canada. Their nearest town was a little place called Squamish, which boasted, in order of importance, 3 bars, a sawmill, and a railway station. Sometimes a lumberjack would marry a barmaid and take her off to his log cabin in the woods, and that was exactly what had happened with Michael and Mary. For Patrick had not been quick enough on the mark. Patrick and Michael were both fallers, fallers. And they'd been working together for 15 years, up and down and around Canada. They'd come as a team, and they were a good one. So close they were like brothers. And they'd even built their cabins nearby one another, before a great stand of pine. They lived a mile apart, but in the forest that makes men close neighbors. One fall morning, Michael knocked on Patrick's door. The smell of brewing coffee and frying bacon wafted out as Patrick opened the door and stared at him. "I'm off to a job in Saskatchewan for a few months," said Michael. "Look after Mary, will ya?" And with a nod, he turned on his heels and stamped off into the forest. Patrick stood looking out after him, his slow but steady brain grinding through the various possibilities, cutting and shaping them like a sawmill. Work was scarce that year, but he and Michael always worked together. But Michael had taken this job alone. It took 2 men to bring down trees, so Michael must have worked with somebody else? That was about as far as Patrick had thought when he smelled burning bacon. That night, Patrick went over to Michael's cabin. Even in his deepest betrayal, he felt obligated to look after his best friend's woman. See, there being no soul other than him and her for miles, he went over to his house. Besides, he wanted to know more about this job in Saskatchewan. He brought her a bottle of whiskey to loosen her tongue and to, warm her up a little bit. Mary met him at the door. Her hair was still nut brown, her eyes sea blue, and her waist dainty after 15 years, just as they had been when Patrick and Michael first met her. She wiped her hand on her white apron and reached out her hand, shook his. The rich scent of stew curled over her shoulder and tickled his nose. He thought how nice it would be if he didn't have to brew his own coffee, and fry his own bacon. If he didn't have to every damn day make his own stew. She looked sad, so he held out the whiskey bottle. "Brought this," he said. "Thanks," she said. She didn't know how much more she knew about the Saskatchewan job than Patrick, but he asked, and she answered. She knew nothing. So they talked about, Michael and him, and then they talked about Michael and her. And finally they didn't talk about Michael at all. The level in the whiskey bottle went down, a little lower, but the cold must have sort of crept into them both because they got closer and closer on the couch, huddled, as if for warmth. And so it went. Fall had become winter, and by the time Michael was due to return, and all of Mary's good stews had put inches on Patrick's waistline, all of his good loving had put inches on hers too. Yeah. Then on Christmas Eve morning, when Patrick was splitting logs out in the snowy yard, he looked up and there stood Michael. A great sack on his back, a big smile splitting his face. Patrick nearly chopped his own damn foot off from the scare. "Michael!" he cried and ran to greet him. Michael looked weather-beaten and lean from his time away, stiff and sturdy as a redwood, and Patrick felt his own hand and soft in his friend's firm handshake. All he'd done for months was chop firewood and eat Mary's stew and make love. He suddenly felt cold and afraid. But Michael pulled him into a bear hug. "You've been looking after her then, eh?" he said, indicating the pile of split wood. "Oh, yeah," said Patrick. "Oh, yeah, every day I come over and chop the wood, and she makes me a bit of stew, and then I'm home by nightfall. Every day." "Oh, you must come over for Christmas dinner tomorrow," smiled Michael. "We can talk about my job in Saskatchewan. Our job in Saskatchewan." The cold feeling in Patrick's chest crackled in his gut. Our job? "Yes, with Mason, your old hook tender. He's in Saskatoon now. Needs 2 men for a big job in the spring. He knows you're good for it, but he wanted to train me up first so we could work together. Pretty good news, eh?" "Yeah," said Patrick faintly. Pretty good. Pretty good." Well, the next morning, Michael suggested they go down and cut a Christmas tree for the big day. Well, Mary prepared the meal. It took a while to find the tree that he wanted, hours of walking, seemingly in circles. But finally they got there, Patrick staring in disbelief at this massive tree. It was a vast, ancient pine, 200 feet high it must have been. It seemed oddly familiar, but even to a lumberjack, trees are pretty hard to tell apart. "Don't know if this one will fit in the cabin there, Mike," he said. Michael grinned. "The top 6 feet will. The rest can be firewood all winter. Stop you from having to come around every day." That was when Patrick knew with utter certainty that Mary had told him. He glanced around frantically. He had no idea where he was going and where he was. There was no place to run. He looked down at his soft belly and the axe in his soft hands. In a single movement, without warning, Michael swung and heaved his axe off his shoulder and hit the tree with a dizzying arc. Automatically, Patrick swung his own axe, and in the rhythm they'd fallen in over the past 15 years, began chopping the massive tree. 2 hours notched the trunk. Now they put the back 2 in with the 2-man saw. And with every pull, as Michael stared upwards, Patrick stared at Michael's face. When would the blow fall? Nobody takes a lumberjack's woman and emerges unscathed. But still they saw it. Until the noonday sun stood high in the white blue sky, and Patrick thought he could smell roasting turkey, but that doesn't make sense because they must have been at least 10 miles away from Michael's cabin. Finally, Michael stepped back, satisfied. "She's ready." He pushed the vast, hard tree once with a great animal roar that sparked icicles in Patrick's blood. The pine creaked and leaned and fell, slow and stately at first, and then with a deafening crash, it seemed to split the earth in 2. The massive tree was down. "Why don't you go chop off the tip?" said Michael. "I'll clean up here." Patrick thought, "Okay," and started the long walk towards the tip of the tree. As he pushed through the newly broken forest, the things around him became suddenly familiar. The mountain range in the distance, the glimmer of the frozen lake to the west, and when he reached the end of the great pine, he realized why. Beneath the bottom of the tree, crushed to splinters and sawdust, was a log cabin. His log cabin. And on the flattened door was a note, which I guess Michael must have pinned there at 6 a.m. that morning in the dark when he came up to pick Patrick up. Patrick picked up the note and read it. It said, "Build further off next time." Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was, one more time for Sean Hebert.